We begin this Sunday morning with the successful rescue mission for the missing weapons system officer on the F-15E Strike Eagle that was shot down over southern Iran on Friday. President Trump posting this on Truth Social. This is the first time in military memory that 2 U.S. pilots have been rescued separately deep in enemy territory. We will never leave an American warfighter behind. God bless America. God bless our troops. And happy Easter to all. The pilot was rescued after ejecting from the fighter jet. A second American fighter jet, an A-10 Warthog searching for the downed F-15E, crashed near the Strait of Hormuz after coming under enemy fire. The lone pilot of that jet was rescued safely. The Strait of Hormuz remains a focal point of the world's energy sector, where 20% of the world's oil passes through, with the vital waterway still virtually shut down to maritime traffic under the threat of Iranian drones and mines, sending the price of crude oil above $110 a barrel and gas prices averaging more than $4 a gallon. Now President Trump is demanding Iran reopen the Strait of Hormuz by tomorrow or face military consequences. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte will meet with the president in Washington this Wednesday as the president considers pulling out of the alliance over their lack of support for Operation Epic Fury. This all comes as President Trump is seeking a 50% increase in military spending in his new budget proposal from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, which is on top of the more than $200 billion the Pentagon is asking for to fund Operation Epic Fury. The president speaking to our own Trey Yingst earlier today. Trey joins us now with more on that. Trey, what's the latest?
Yeah, Jackie, good morning. I just spoke with President Trump for about 15 minutes, and he told me if Iran doesn't make a deal and fast, that he's considering blowing up everything and taking their oil. The president went on to say you're going to see bridges and power plants dropping all over their country. Now, I asked the commander-in-chief about the possibility of a diplomatic solution. He told me he thinks he can get a deal with Iran by tomorrow. They are dragging their feet, but he told me, I think there is a good chance tomorrow. They are negotiating now. All of this taking place as Fox News can report that overnight a daring rescue operation happened inside of Iranian territory. There were hundreds of U.S. Special Forces inside the country rescuing the U.S. crew member who ejected from an F-15 on Friday when it was shot down by the Iranians. A senior U.S. official tells me that the CIA used a deception campaign to make the Iranians think that they were moving a valuable package out of the country through a maritime exfil. This official went on to say this was meant to draw the Iranians away from the area where this U.S. crew member was located. The U.S. government was concerned, Jackie, that the Iranians were playing a trick on the U.S. And it wasn't until Saturday morning that the CIA director was able to confirm the location and the identity of that U.S. service member inside of Iran. And then that set off a chain reaction where the Secretary of War and the Joint Chiefs Chairman, along with the president, were notified. And this source telling Fox News that within 8 hours, we had planes in motion. Within almost 12 hours, we were on the ground in Iran. It gives you a sense of the behind the scenes of what was taking place. And again, I spoke with the president after that successful operation last night to rescue the U.S. service member. He spoke about the excellence of the U.S. military and went on to tell Fox News more details about the ongoing operation against the Iranian regime. But again, that headline, the president telling me he believes a deal can be reached by tomorrow. And he says if the Iranians do not make a deal, that we can expect to see power plants and bridges all over the country. He says he's calling it Power Plant and Bridge Day will be struck as a result of their unwillingness to come to the table. A lot of headlines here, Jackie, and I'll toss it back to you.
A ton of breaking news, Trey. Thank you so much for that. But I do just want to hone in on one thing. If there is no deal by tomorrow, and the president is suggesting that there could be, he's talking about what the next phases seem to be. He's talking about power plants and bridges, but no mention of the major nucleus of the oil infrastructure in Kharg Island. In your opinion, from having spoken to him, does it seem like he is sort of holding off on that for the time being?
He told me he is considering taking over Iran's oil because at this point, the Iranians have been unwilling to make an agreement with the United States, despite the repeated efforts by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to give the Iranians an off-ramp. And so these negotiations are taking place. The president tells me the Iranian negotiators have been granted what could be described as temporary amnesty so that they won't be killed as these negotiations take place. But if this deal is not reached by tomorrow, the president has indicated that the United States will target Iran's energy infrastructure, their power plants, and a number of other bridges across the country. There was another interesting thing that the president told me about the situation in Iran. You might remember how all of this began earlier this year when the Iranian regime, according to the president, killed 45,000 of their own people, those protesters who were in the streets of their country. And the president told me that the United States sent guns to the Iranian protesters through the Kurds. And the president told me, quote, "We sent guns to the protesters, a lot of them, and he thinks the Kurds took the guns." And again, this gives you a sense of the president making good on his promise to show up for these protesters who took to their streets demonstrating peacefully against their government, and they were met with live ammunition. You might remember earlier this year, the president said help is on the way. It appears that was part of the help the president was talking about. But again, today we are looking at a much broader situation as Operation Epic Fury is now around day 36. And the president has been very clear, if the Iranians do not make a deal, he will target their energy infrastructure.
Fascinating. Trey Yingst, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. Joining me now is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Arkansas Congressman Rick Crawford. Congressman, it's great to have you on the program today. As we were going into this, we knew the deadline to open the Strait of Hormuz, according to the president, is tomorrow. Very important, vital waterway to move energy around the globe and crucial to global oil prices and stability right now as well. The president telling Trey that there is the potential for a deal. It could come as soon as tomorrow. But if not, red lines have been drawn. In the past, he said, open it or face hell. He said that he will bomb the Iranians back to the Stone Ages. It certainly sounds like he is prepared to do that.
Yeah, I wouldn't toy with him if I were the Iranians. You saw what he did in Venezuela. He has a lot of backbone, and he's not going to be dissuaded. So I think it would be in the interests of the Iranians to go ahead and make this deal. And by the way, that Strait of Hormuz, the Omanis and the Emiratis have as much claim to the Strait of Hormuz as Iran does, and they are basically breaking international law. So it's in their interest to try to make a deal before the consequences rain down on them.
My understanding is that the White House has said tomorrow afternoon at 1 p.m. there will be a news conference. We're not necessarily sure what we will hear. It sounds like the situation is very fluid. But one thing is for sure, the president has been very transparent with the American people, updating us every step of the way. Your thoughts on what he could talk about potentially tomorrow? It could be a deal.
Well, it could be a deal, and honestly, I hope that's the result. But the president has demonstrated that we can sit back and sort of try to get in his head and figure out what he's going to do. He's not above surprising people, and he's done that before, and he may have some surprises we're not being briefed on. But I think what he is telling people is that I want to give them a diplomatic out. He's trying to give them every opportunity to make the right choice, do the right thing, and I think that window is going to be open for a little while longer, but after that, it's going to close decisively, and the president will take action.
And the president has also talked about standing with the Iranian people and giving them an opportunity for regime change, to take their country back. Obviously, this is a regime for 47 years that has treated its own people very brutally, and there is appetite for that on the ground in Iran. But more importantly, to the military operation, regime change, I think, would also be crucial because it's difficult to finish the mission or leave the region with underlings of the IRGC in charge that you potentially cannot trust because they were part of the root of the problem.
Yeah, this goes back 47 years, as you indicated, and so there's really never been a better time to try to support this organic regime change. The reality is the regime has changed. What I think people hear when we hear the term regime change, it's as if the United States is rolling in there to try to install somebody that they want to run the country. That's not what this president is about. He's trying to create the conditions under which the Iranian people can now reclaim their country and engage in self-determination on their own terms in a way that is good for the Iranian people and good for the region and good for the world.
And Congressman, I want to talk about the other breaking news this morning. Overnight, the announcement of the rescue of the missing service member, one of the most daring search and rescue operations in American history. The president has said no one will be left behind. This is incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a testament to the leadership in the White House and the Pentagon. And look, if there are ever any doubts about the capability of the U.S. military, you can put those doubts away. We have the preeminent military in the world. Everybody knows it. And I never had any doubt. I watched this unfold throughout the last 48 hours or so, and I was confident in our ability to retrieve our downed pilot. And look, we didn't even sustain any casualties in this operation. Yes, we left some material behind. That's part of the deal. Our guys ended up having to actually destroy a couple of aircraft on the ground to prevent that technology from falling into enemy hands. But beyond that, I mean, there were no casualties, and the skill and the training is just unparalleled.
It's incredible. House Intelligence Committee Chairman, Congressman Rick Crawford, thank you so much for being here, and happy Easter.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.